So my name's Francis Davis, so I'm a dad of four, and when I first graduated, I was supposed to go to Unilever to go and be a brand manager, and just before I went to Unilever, spent some time with an archbishop in Durban, and as a consequence of that, didn't, and went instead to work in a dockland parish on the south coast with tower blocks, a bit like Grenfell, where we were so frustrated by the quality of the local services from this church base that we started inventing entrepreneurial responses to the needs of the people. And so we founded from that parish base an organisation that today still employs 1,000 people in the health and social care sector. We founded a social care programme that still mobilises about 400 volunteers, if you include all the families that are involved as well, and pays some people to go out and do individual social care work. And then, via a spell in the private sector, ended up in universities, and since then have worked in universities, central government, civil society. So an active researcher, taught at Cambridge, then Oxford, then got taken into government to work for the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and then came out the other side of that, and then after a spell in consultancy, came to Birmingham, and have been a professor at Birmingham for a while. And along the way, some personal kind of challenges in between all of that, isn't it? Because over and above the things you do professionally are the things that happen in family, that happen with neighbours, that happen with next door, that happen with your good parish priest, your bad parish priest, your in-between rector, and so on and so forth. So my title tonight's 50 and Beyond. In one sense, I'm doing a life review, more of which in a second, finding hope and encouragement after hard knocks. And when the churches, and I put churches, not just one church, may have let you down. And my approach tonight, just for the next 25 minutes or so, 25 minutes, is to work, to reflect personally, then to critically analyse, and just, although I have a theology degree, just for those of you who might be wanting some systematic theology, I'm a social scientist. So when I see a church, I do see a church, but I also see a sea of evidence. I was once asked to go to Liverpool and address the Diocesan Justice and Peace Conference, and I did a talk on the diocesan accounts. On the diocesan accounts as a statement of their moral priorities, and I worked through the diocesan accounts, showing where the money had been spent and how this told us about the real priorities of the diocese were. And the then Archbishop wrote in fury afterwards saying, "Who was it gave you those accounts?" So I had to explain to the dear man that they were publicly available at the Charity Commission, and I'd just downloaded them off the internet. And it's really interesting, actually, and I've just been doing it again recently, working through the accounts of every single diocese and also the websites of every Catholic cathedral, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And what I'm really interested in is trying to frame in a new way some of the conversations that we have about God, religion, some people call that faith or belief, the divine, because I think some of the ways it gets talked about in our society is too easy, and when it comes to the way that we age or the way that we think about what hope is, it doesn't necessarily help us. Because this word belief or faith can get quite individualised, or it can get quite stuck in the head, or about what we think, and about what we think on our own. And it seems to me what's increasingly important is the way actually that institutions think. And it's not very popular in British sociology to say that institutions think. It's definitely not very popular in kind of some catechetical and intense one-on-one conversion programs to say that institutions matter. But I think that they do. And by institutions, I don't just mean the BBC, but I mean those habits and reference points and connection points that kind of form the background noise of a society, form the background way of even the way that we think about the things that are good and bad, because they're kind of slightly preloaded into us. If for no other reason that when we think and we talk about something bad or good that's happened, we're using a language. And the moment you use a language, you're talking about something that's more than yourself because it's shared with somebody else. And in that sense, we're thinking together, even when we're thinking that we're thinking alone. And I think that matters for what I'm going to say shortly as well. So, you get to 50, you've had a few knocks. Maybe everyone in this room tonight. No, I'm not going to say that. We're all over 21 this evening. And those knocks can come in such direct ways, can't they? That job went. 80% of people leave their boss, not their job or their workplace. So that boss came along, or that restructure hit. So in my family, in recent times, just before one family member's 16th birthday, they were the subject of a crime, violent attack. And as a result, became quite ill, with all the knock-on consequences that you then encounter for road testing the whole of the NHS and social care system. So, residential, time in a residential unit, time on hospital wards, time in A&E, time at home, time providing 24-hour care. That person needing 24-hour care in the household. And I'm not going to say more than that because I'm being recorded and people might listen, including that person, and it wouldn't be appropriate to divulge lots of details. But one can go, for example, as happened, from having just got the dream job of your life to realising that while you're at work, you're fretting about that, and when you're at home, you're fretting about work. So you might need to leave work to go and do this because it's more important. Yeah, and then you find that carer's allowance doesn't even cover the electrics bill, that some employers are incredibly supportive and some are just breathtakingly awful. Yeah, and what you discover along the way is what I call the silent bond, which is you sit in a parent support group and you discover sitting in that room are a night shift worker at the local car factory, a cleaner from down the road at the port, and the permanent secretary and the permanent secretary's wife, and you've got one shared kind of common bond and silent bond, and it breaks through everything, but it's a moment of crucifixion, let's call it that. There are other life's course disruptions, aren't there? When the big cancer comes calling. I have a friend at the moment, he'd be younger than me, being in his 40s, had a massive stroke at Christmas, has a tumour, the tumour's been removed, not looking so good. Other friends, of course, that life course disruption might be a stillbirth. Yeah. During the lockdown, maybe we were all spending too much time on Facebook, but I ended up being reconnected with a whole bunch of primary school friends. And we discovered that it wasn't just our year group that had a teacher called Jerry Loxton who would literally kick us in the head and in the face and in the back and drag us by our hair along the corridors and hold us underwater for 3 minutes in the pool. We discovered that he'd carried on like this for about 10 to 12 years. So moments of crucifixion, a teacher that behaved like that at the time you kind of thought was normal, but you look back on it and you think you were 8. A crime might hit the family, one of those life course disruption. And then, of course, the interplay between all of that and the engagement with the churches. And I don't know, anthropology called this everyday lived Catholicism. So, a funeral, grieving parents, this is a real example, grieving parents, grieving siblings in their early 20s. The oldest son has just died as a result of an anaphylactic shock. He asked whether or not there were peanuts in the meal, but no one thought to think whether or not the whole meal had been cooked in peanut oil, so he didn't make it. Parish priest comes round to visit the family. The siblings are home because they don't normally live at home with the parents. The only thing the parish priest was interested in that first family call was why they hadn't been seen at Mass for the last year, without checking first whether they actually still lived locally post-graduating. Not an ideal moment. A young curate comes bubbling out of seminary, bumbles into my home parish. My home parish, 7 o'clock on a Sunday night, is the parish where if you're a Catholic and you're a resident at the local psychiatric unit and you're well enough, they'll bring you to Mass. So this particular night, as usual, the Catholic residents have been brought to Mass at the 7 o'clock service. This young curate, beretta wearing, much lace using, much orthodoxy claiming, much truth insisting, proceeded to preach without even having thought who's in the 400 in front of him on the only true psychologist is a priest, because only a priest can be a doctor of the soul. And ladies and gentlemen, if anyone tells you, he said, that they are a psychologist and they're not a priest, you must not believe a word that they say, because this means that they're selling you something which is not theologically sound, not in keeping with the teaching of the church, and so on and so forth. So 2 of the 4 from the unit went back to the unit that night and refused their medication because they'd been advised to take it by a psychologist. 2 of the 4 ended up getting incredibly distressed and needing one to be resectioned and the other one forcibly taken back to his room, because this fella had not thought, a bit like the first fella, what he was going to do. Moments of crucifixion, yeah? And we can add to these, can't we, if we look back across our lives and the way that we make sense of them and the way that some of these things are still raw right now and some of these things are a bit less raw right now. And then you can smell something and then they're suddenly all raw again, or hear a word or meet a person that takes you straight back to that place very, very quickly. And of course, if you've been around the churches, we have to talk a little bit about the episcopal lies about clergy sex abuse crisis. Now, I call it that because I'd want to argue that if you have 1.2 billion adherents, hundreds of thousands of clergy, over 1 million religious women, over 2 million paid members of staff in your social welfare institutions, at some point you're going to employ some people or take on some people who've got an illness in that regard, with regard to their treatment of children or with regard to the treatment of women, or all sorts of other problems, unless you have really good systems. Yeah. And so lots of organisations that are operating at that scale are likely by accident to recruit people who've got a problem, if they haven't got good systems. It seems to me the even bigger crisis than that first offence is then lying that you recruited that person and lying what they did when it's been evidence that they did. But here, you see, it's not just a question of simple faith or of simple crucifixion in that regard, because when we go empirically looking at the institutions, we see there's immense variation. So some will say to us, do you know what? The best way to address the moment of crucifixion, which is episcopal lies about clergy abuse and clergy abuse, is that these men should have more faith. And if they'd had more faith, they wouldn't have had this problem. Or if the church had been holier, it wouldn't have attracted anybody sinful into its ranks. But if you look at the Australian data, and I'm using the Australian data so as to stay away from English, context in which people, may have had personal experience. If it was a question of faith, why is it that the Salesians of Don Bosco had 17.2% of their clergy arrested, the Vincentians only 8%, and the Palatines between that point at 11%? Why is it that there were hardly any offences committed by Dominicans and Jesuits in the context of the Australian church? Does this make sense? That variation between religious orders. Why is it that if you draw a map of Australia and then you put a heat dot in each diocese, it goes from 24% of all clergy in one diocese, down to 5.1 at the other end of the scale, with an average of 15 across all of them, but you've got huge variation by diocese. Is this because one diocese was more or less sinful? Is it because it was more or less virtuous? Yeah? Or was it that particular religious orders had particularly weak systems, and so they became honeypots to people that wanted to break through and have access to people? And that particular dioceses responded so slowly that the numbers kept going up whilst others began to put in place institutional reforms and changes in policies and procedure to weed out what was happening. And the reason I mention this is not really to dig deep into the abuse crisis, although it has been a crisis at enormous scale, but to enable us to say that those moments of crucifixion are about us and they hit us, and the abuse crisis has hit families. But actually they're manifested in the way that institutions behave, and they become the cause and consequence of the challenge. And I think back, if we're over 50 and we're thinking back to some of what we will have seen institutionally and in the habits of the communities around us and in our own lives, thinking back in such a way that we can see what was healthy in the huge variety of institutions and the ecosystem of communities and communities around us, is one way of reflecting back to make sense of some of the things that we might have thought were hard knocks. We had a priest when I was a lad, Jerry Fallon, fantastic fella, during one World Cup, because Scotland were going to play at 10 o'clock in the morning because of the time difference to Argentina, I think it was. He managed to get through Mass in about 7.5 minutes. He played for Celtic as a seminarian, right? And he became a hero overnight to all the chaps in the parish, and a source of absolute scandal to those that weren't interested in football. But he'd come south to England because there'd been a woman and the relationship had needed to end, and there'd also been quite a lot of booze. Yeah, and when I look back on it, and I think of all the amazing things that he did for the young people in that parish, I think of him now as an even more amazing character than I did at the time, because I had absolutely no insight whatsoever in terms of what he might have been self-managing when he was engaging with us. We had a priest in Portsmouth Diocese recently who passed away, and the bishop couldn't make it to the funeral because this man wasn't probably considered to be very, very important. But the Mass to say farewell to him was in the cathedral, and the cathedral was not just packed, it was packed and heaving. And down the bottom right-hand quarter of the cathedral were about 40, 50 fellas who, when you looked at them, you'd think they were either on their way to have a day out at court, or they'd gone and bought their first ever white shirt and black trousers. And these were the kids who'd come on the summer camps that this priest had run for 40 years. Lads that work on the docks in Portsmouth in the dockyard, never been near a church. And they'd all got in touch with each other and rocked up. So what happens in institutions and in the ecosystems of relationships around us can contribute to those crucifixions, can't they? But also to the potential moments of resurrection. The arrival of a child or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew. A lovely marriage and a happy wedding. One of the times I've been in here was with my brother and sister-in-law's wedding. The small things that come from repeated things in familiar places. When I get very stressed, I go back and listen to music that I've known since I was about 8 or 9 or 10. Praying, not praying. Longing to pray. Enduring. Trying to pray whilst hearing nothing. Trying to pray whilst feeling like you're getting through but not being listened to. Praying again, giving up, going away, coming back. Maybe going out, walking miles and miles and miles, seeing one bird flow over you and suddenly understanding what prayer is after all that time you spent banging around at Mass in the parish. and the institutions of hope that carry some of those feelings, not just our own feelings. So, globally, the Catholic Church, and just that's the data that I picked up whilst looking for this evening. We could add to the Anglican Communion and others. Institutions of Hope, the Catholic Church runs 16,000 homes for the elderly, 5,500 hospitals, that's more than the NHS, 18,000 health clinics. 80% of those are concentrated in the poorest nations in the planet. There is a wonderful retired daughter of Jesus, a nun, called Anne Rossiter, who lives just outside London. She joined the Daughters of Jesus, having already become a midwife, a nurse, not yet a midwife. And her mother superior said, "You can go to Africa and deliver babies into the world," because she couldn't bear the thought of having one of her sisters coming home having touched ladies' bits all day if the convent was to be clean in England. So she sent Sister Anne off down to Africa, and Sister Anne says, "I ended up on my own in a hospital 250 miles from the nearest bishop. And this, Francis, is the optimum distance from any bishop, at least 250 yards." And in that clinic, she set about sorting out the very large number of deaths that were being encountered at childbirth, and introduced such a successful system that the number of deaths in childbirth came down by, I think it was 90%. So that her next job, when she was due to go back to this pristine, clean English convent, was actually to be invited to go and lead all midwifery for the World Health Organization to see if they couldn't replicate some of these solutions and some of these successes that she trailblazed on the ground. If you map the funds of the Catholic Church, you'll get in trouble with archbishops. There is an absolutely amazing young American woman at the moment, and she's using AI and blockchain. Right? This is like upmarket digital stuff that I need to turn to my son and ask about. But she's basically using it to raid every land registry in the planet, and also other reported and unreported transactions of property, to be able to come up with an actual statement of account of how much land, what land, and the current market value of the land that the church is and has globally. And I was fascinated by this, so I sat down and started totting up the value of Catholic institutions in the Archdiocese of Sydney. So there's a few hospitals. They're not poor, are they? There's lots of real estate, there's cathedrals, you've got the accounts. The thing about the Catholic Church is it's so megally decentralised in terms of its governance, whilst being allegedly centralised in its theology. It's really, really hard to work that one out. But my estimate would be that the Archdiocese of Sydney and the Archdiocese of Brisbane combined are about as wealthy as the Gates Foundation, but with none of the social impact and civic contributions that the Gates Foundation would seem to be making in Africa. The 19 Catholic schools, private schools in this country, turn over £300 million, and they're in the top 10% of rural employers. They create 2,400 rural jobs in the rural economy. So if they weren't there, that'd be 2,500 families without jobs in the rural sector, another 1,500 in urban contexts like this one. And there's a nice picture here. Can you see those children? Yeah. So institutions of hope. Bishop Marcus Stock, the Bishop of Leeds, when he arrived in Leeds as bishop, said, "There's not enough schools-based music in our cathedrals." So tried to put together choirs and all sorts of other initiatives, and then has used the cathedral as an anchor to grow choral music in all of his diocesan schools. This has worked so well, it's spread out to Salford Diocese, which is the one that covers Manchester, and to other Catholic dioceses. It's worked so well that that's now been adopted by the Association of English Cathedrals, which is the Anglican network of cathedrals. And if you go Google, there's a lovely speech, I think it's by the Bishop of Southwark in the House of Lords, praising the Leeds model of choral singing. Yeah. And I spent about 3-4 hours, and I can't find it covered anywhere in the Catholic world outside Leeds' website and Leeds' annual report. So this is the other thing I think about these moments of crucifixion and the moments of hope, is that we capture the moments of crucifixion quite quickly ourselves and can forget the moments of hope. And then on institutions, we capture the institutional moments of crucifixion and we can't even know about some of the good stuff to be able to cheer ourselves up or to find some succour. And that's really, really, really a problem when it seems to me that the best way that we can build positive attributes and positive outlooks is by creating a way of thinking that locates us in a carescape or an ecosystem of relationships. So lots of churches, denominations will go really big on everything has to be done in the parish, everything has to be done in the congregation. Holy Trinity Brompton, the big home of Alpha. It's a mega church according to the academic studies. There are 4 or 5 other churches in London that have been studied and are considered to be mega churches by focusing on their congregation. The definition of a mega church is a congregation that has more than 2,000 adherents. But when you start looking at ecosystems, that begins to unravel. So Holy Trinity Brompton, when you look at its accounts, turns over about 4.5 million. Alpha International turns over about 19 million. You put those two things together, that's 23 million. That's about the size of the Diocesan Social Welfare Agency in the Archdiocese of Liverpool. But if the Archdiocesan Social Welfare Agency in Liverpool said, we're transforming the world, Scouse humour would kick in and go, you're overstating a bit, aren't you really? The mega church called Kingsway turns over, I think it's about 8-9 million from memory. This doesn't mean that it's not an insignificant institution, but that would be 8-9 million would be the size of the Diocesan Social Welfare Organisation in Birmingham. But because we get focused in on congregation, we forget the ecosystem of the diocesan agency, of the associations, of the other relationships, of the one-off gifts of help that happen from time to time, and even the days when the parish priest gets it right and comes and says exactly the right thing. And I'll never forget that when my wife had a miscarriage, there was a priest turned up, Salesian, said just nothing, and just sat there and then sprinkled holy water all over the ward. And we were so somewhere caught between immense horror that he was dousing everybody else in the ward and a sort of immense kind of like sense of feeling loved, that we just ended up sitting in the middle of it all laughing our heads off about this experience, if that makes sense. So by developing that habit of thinking that relocates, even where we are on our worst days, within an ecosystem of what might be better, maybe there's a way to construct hope. So let's look very quickly now at hope. In 2020, I spent several months in Rwanda, commissioned by Tear Fund, the Evangelical Alliances Relief Fund, to do the first ever study of elders 25 years after a genocide. And we went in and we interviewed at close quarters in the villages 265 Rwandan elders, using as our access point Presbyterian and Anglican churches. We interviewed in her dwelling, not much bigger than that, going back to the wall, Miriam, let's call her Miriam to anonymise her. Miriam had a practical problem that day, which is every day she had no water supply, and every day she had very little food. She cared for a disabled husband who'd been disabled since the genocide. She'd lost 4 of her 5 children. The 5th one, she said, just died of an ordinary heart attack in his 50s. She had no water supply, so she'd paid some of the local lads a few pence or a few cents to go get some water from the stream, which is about a mile off, comes back nut brown. And she'd also said to them, could you cultivate my little plot? Because if she didn't cultivate, she'd have no food. And lads being lads, they'd taken the money and done a runner, not come back with the water, not come back having done the work. she just kept scooping up her little Bible, which she clearly, absolutely and totally and intimately knew, and rifling through to Lamentations and to the Psalms, and just kept breaking out into song. It was a sense of kind of amazing power in the midst of absolutely nothing. Wonderful. We then went to a centre set up by the President, the First Lady of Rwanda, for the most destitute elderly, and we interviewed at length one woman. She'd lost, I think, 17 members of the family. She'd become homeless. She'd ended up migrating to the city and living destitute. Eventually, someone from the Baptist networks had found her and brought her to this place, and throughout the whole of this time, her arms had been like this. Yeah, and so she'd have to do everything like this. And this is because during the genocide, petrol had been poured upon her, and she'd been destitute and on her own, so she'd done this to defend her and kept this there while it hurt so much, and then that's how the skin had healed. And so in this amazing centre, they'd enabled her to have an operation to be able to use her arms again, and she just described the sheer joy of her first shower, where she could feel the water flowing across her body. Maybe a place where there's not much right to be hope, but there was sheer hope there. In 2004, a couple of us from Cambridge set up something called the International Young Leaders Network, to quote the mission, to identify, nurture, train and sustain young and emerging Christian leaders internationally. 2 weeks intensive residential in the UK, 2 weeks intensive residential in another context, Romania, Gaza, America, and so on and so forth. And the only question when you applied was, what's the biggest challenge you've ever faced? So some would say it was my bar exams, others would say my first election campaign, others growing up being a carer of a brother with a severe mental illness. My favourite was Andy, what's the biggest challenge you've ever faced? Explaining to a judge at 14 why I was driving an Audi. So what did you say to the judge? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? I'd nicked the Audi to replace the Capri that I nicked when I was 12, and I've been driving since I was 12, right? But a witness didn't turn up. He got off. He's turned his life around. He's just had his first kid. He now is in social care management. He's had some time managing the very agency that had adopted him from birth with his twin brother, gone back as a residential worker, now married with a wonderful wife, got a little kid, and working his way up the social care networks. Helen, who came through that programme, came from Scotland, feisty, in-your-face Scottish young woman, and she's gone on to work in Darfur, some of the really, really most sensitive trouble spots of the planet, to lead for the Red Cross in advocacy. The two failures, two of them went off and became priests, which for a lay formation programme, ironically ends up being a failed key performance indicator. But we've had 400, in the main, absolutely amazing young people come through, now working in Parliament, running national networks, doing research, teaching, organising clergy. And we did all of that with a basically huge amount of time gifted from parishes like this, and hardly any money at all. It was all done mobilising the gifted time of people who'd done things and wanted new ways to give back. And then last ray of hope, John Willis. In Portsmouth, the Anglican Cathedral had a building it wasn't using, so we sat down with the Dean and said, could we call this the Cathedral Innovation Centre? And we then asked the cathedral parish of the Catholic Cathedral and the Anglican Cathedral working together to volunteer in a new way by mentoring startups for people who'd had one of these life course disruptions, who'd been through a moment of crucifixion, wanted to relaunch their life again, or others who just wanted to do something new. John Willis came forward. John's born with no arms and no legs. He founded a social venture called Power to Inspire. This year, I think he's ITV's fundraiser of the year, bringing people together who are able-bodied and not able-bodied to do sport together. his time for a mile in the Eaton Dorney Lake swimming is faster than my time for a mile, and he doesn't have the limbs. This year, with no arms, he canoed the River Thames. There's a lovely story about him. He was born disabled, took himself off to Cambridge because he wasn't having any truck with those who said he wouldn't get on, and then later takes himself off to do a public service MBA at Warwick Business School. And John is there on the first day of the course. There's a big bank classroom. The room is full of people from the leaders in public service and related businesses. The eminent professor comes in at the front and says, I want this year to change your life. I really want you to think. I want you to take advantage of every opportunity. I want it to really inspire you. So to enable this, I've put all of my favourite books at the front, and I want all of you, and John is sitting right at the back of this bank classroom, to be able to borrow these books whenever you want, but I warn you, if you don't bring them back, I'll chop your arms off. Exactly, so half the room froze and half the room sort of looked up, and John jumped up and said, if anyone needs a book nicking, I am your man, right? And that's the way that he gently pushes back and builds relationships with humour and across silos that some of us wouldn't even get near. So it seems to me that when we've had hard knocks, we just need to keep getting up again. Somebody once said to me that when you've got a kid who's going through a really bad patch, or a grandchild, being a parent is a bit like being Gandhi. Now this interested me because I'm quite political. I said, why is it like being Gandhi? So it's like this. Gandhi got up, gently marched down, complained about the salt policy, got hit on the head, sent away by the British. Gandhi got up again, came back, protested about something else. This time another party established, smashed him on the head, got up and came back again. I said, so what's the analogy? They said, being a parent is just like being like Gandhi. The only difference is the British are never going to go home if you're dad or granddad. You're going to have just to keep coming back gently and softly again and again and again. And it seems to me that that's really important as a way of thinking as we locate those knocks within an ecosystem where there's always someone or somebody or some place that wants to connect with us to help us reframe the way that was about. So it's not just where our faith's at. It's not just about the believing. It's about the way of thinking and about the connecting. And in that sense, it's about a fundamental commitment to love embedded in ecosystems that sometimes we drop out of because we can't cope, don't like them, priest upset us, neighbour upset us, difficult sister-in-law upset us, or whatever. So sometimes they're ecosystems that we drop out of, or sometimes that they dropped us. But keeping coming back and reconnecting seems to me to be important. Because when we commit to take part, seems to me, we've got more hope than if we sit privately and just say, I can think my way out of this, I can pray my way out of this, and somehow it will be sorted out. And there is good research in psychology to support this as well, insofar as Professor Peter Coleman at Southampton University followed a large cohort of people as they aged from their 30s all the way through to late life. And the way that people adjusted, the way that people reviewed back on what had happened, made sense again, kept telling the story and remaking the sense of something that had been traumatic, in the context of that lifespan and thinking back in that way. And actually the folk that struggled most later in life were those who had the most certain religious convictions. Because every time one of these big life disruptions hit, one of these big things had hit, it had kind of entered a rigid frame that wasn't open to an ecosystem that might lean in to support it as it was struggling. And everything was then attempted to be forced into the box of the rigidity, and this was across several denominations, so this is not about theological stances, and ended up in late life cracking open in some quite challenging ways. So, moments of crucifixion, they've come, We need to keep talking about them, reflecting back on them, and I don't mean only in the therapeutic sense. Moments of resurrection are everywhere if we're looking across the whole ecosystem of love that's around us. But if we don't make the effort to find them, and the church doesn't help us better to identify where they've forgotten that they were even getting around to doing it, then that's going to be a struggle, isn't it? But the most important thing is to step up and take part. Moses ran away with the people of Israel, didn't he? Out of Egypt, leading them to freedom. In the Bible or in Sunday school or in catechesis, many of us were told that the great hero led the people of Israel down to the Red Sea, put his staff into the water lifted up, and then Moses led the people of Israel to freedom. In the Torah, this story is told a slightly different way, which is that Moses comes piling down of Egypt, being chased by the soldiers. He arrives at the beach and goes, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" And like lots of other leaders, and I'm developing this now, has an outbreak of of lack of confidence, starts pacing up and down the beach saying, "What am I going to do?" Taking wise advice probably from the women whilst he panics. And while he's doing this, a young lad, Naxam ben Adminabab, takes a step into the water lifts up, and this young boy leads the people of Israel to freedom. Now, if you tell that story to junior nurses, they automatically say, "Oh, well, that means that Moses was like senior management in our hospital end, wasn't it? He got all the credit for what we in the front line did by leading the people of Israel to freedom." But it seems to me the important thing to take away from this is that without an ecosystem of the women having the debate with Moses as he paced up and down the beach to create the space by accident by which the young lad could lead the people of Israel to freedom, and then for that story not to be retold in such a way that that can all be connected up again, you could still only be running through saying it was all perfect because Moses led us through and there was only one person ever did this for us, and that's the way it's going to go. Because 50 is the new 30, and there's still plenty of hope, and thanks for listening.